Welcome to the Sherman Report. Here's Peter Sherman.
Hi there. There is a discussion in progress, certainly privately, but not surprisingly, also in the media, and it's about whether the September 10th debate between Kamala Harris and Donald Trump uses the same technical setup as the ill-fated debate, ill-fated really for only one person, that was Joe Biden, when he debated Trump back about 6 weeks ago. Now, remember, nothing could have saved him. However, there are technical decisions that have to be made about things like debates, and they're discussed by both sides, and they're the subject of arguments. And they have to be made sooner rather than later because the different sides believe that one thing or another will enhance or detract from their particular candidate's ability to score with the voters, who are, of course, the public. So the conversation right now is about microphone muting. Microphone muting, as it sounds, is turning off the microphone of a non-answering participant. There are two participants. One is Kamala Harris, one is Donald Trump. So when Kamala Harris answers a question or is otherwise speaking, the idea would be turn off Donald Trump's mic. I know a lot of you out there are saying, well, he just jabbers away anyway. It doesn't matter. The point is, you wouldn't hear much from him. She'd dominate. The same is true in reverse. She couldn't comment on what he was saying when he speaks. So today is the 28th of August. We finished the month in 3 days, and the debate is 10 days after that. So I guess 2 weeks from yesterday, and they better get it settled or there will be no debate, but I think they will. So obviously, I'm talking about the concept that exists when candidate A speaks over candidate B. Candidate A's microphone has to be muted. Doesn't matter the sequence of A or B. What matters is whether we can hear a response without also hearing interfering taunts and so forth from the opponent, regardless of who that may be. So this is the debate going on now. In other words, it's the debate before the debate. The sides are sparring on the issue of so-called hot mics. It seems to be the only thing that they're talking about, and I've got to believe they've got this settled by now. Currently, the competing campaigns have different views. That's the last thing I've seen. But I can't believe that a couple of hours later they can't figure it out. Obviously, there was no challenge to Donald Trump when Joe Biden went up against him. He couldn't get his sentences out. So it didn't matter whether a mic was muted, but they were, and it seemed to work. Harris wants the mics of both campaigns to be live all the time. For the life of me, I can't figure out why she'd want Donald Trump talking in her ear. Maybe her people think, because it's not her, maybe her people think that if he tries to do that, that will be a denigrating factor for him in the eyes of people who might otherwise vote for him. To me, and especially considering it's the Harris campaign doing the pushing, I'm kind of gobsmacked that she'd elect not to be able to speak when asked a question without the interference from her opponent. Trump back in 2016 was almost famous for nonstop commentary in the debate at that time. And is that what you want, Kamala? If I were her, I'd shut the front door and let the individual microphones carry an individual message alone and uninterrupted. But it seems that's not what Harris and her people want. Why? Hey, you're going to have to ask them, not me.
You're with the Sherman Report. Daily news commentary live at 5 p.m. Video version live at X, YouTube, and Facebook. Here's Peter Sherman.
If you're watching me and you know me well, then you know that I spent about 10 years living in Niagara-on-the-Lake, Ontario. For you who are further afield, in Quebec, I know we've got a lot of viewers in the States. Niagara-on-the-Lake is the Canadian side of the Niagara River, and the other side is Lewiston, New York. And it's an interesting and storied town, which I will talk about another day. But this goes back to that point. I've never thought much about temporary workers, except that when I lived in Niagara-on-the-Lake, they were pretty much ubiquitous. You'd see them everywhere. That is, it wouldn't be a cherry or a peach orchard, much less a vineyard, if not for the omnipresent temporary workers. So obvious in their native garb, they were differentiated from domestic workers that way. So you could see the Chinese wide-brimmed hats. You could see shorter people, and I'm not trying to put Mexicans down. Mexican male workers are typically somewhere between 5 feet and 5'5". And you'd always know what you were looking at when you saw temporary workers in Niagara, and they were often chauffeured between their bunkhouses, which were in common to the fields, sitting legs hanging over the back of a flatbed trailer being pulled by a tractor. I mean, it's all illegal under the Motor Vehicle Act, but you're talking about the bunkhouse to the field. Anyway, I digress. The point is they're pretty visible in a place like Niagara-on-the-Lake. So they're differentiated from domestic workers in that sense. Besides, there was never any discussion. They were needed and they were welcomed. And now the self-appointed, I suppose, maestro of all oppressed people in the world, Justin Trudeau, is wavering. He says that temporary workers under the temporary worker program, that'll have to be scaled back. I don't know why. And the reason I say that is I'm well aware over years that temporary workers come in because they take jobs that Canadians don't want. I'm talking about living here, breathing here, Canadians don't want to take. Now, I understand unemployment is rising in Canada. We're at about 6.5%. That's starting to be in the, hey, we don't want that category, and I don't see it going down very soon. Maybe that speaks well to what the Bank of Canada may do with our rates over the next couple of weeks, but I don't know. Anyway, Trudeau says the program must be reined in as Canada's unemployment rate continues to rise. I mean, he's obviously recognizing the same thing, but even when it was high and higher than 6.5%, we needed temporary workers. So I get what he's saying, but I'm thinking that that's a lot of posturing. Canadians just don't or won't wade into a vineyard and prune grapes. They don't, and they won't. But I'll give you a quote. He says, we no longer need as many temporary foreign workers. We need Canadian businesses to invest in training and technology and not increase their reliance on low-cost foreign labor. This came from our esteemed Prime Minister at the start of a 3-day Halifax cabinet retreat. And I'm saying, okay, Justin, who's picking the fruit in Niagara? Do you really think that training and technology are the things that they have to invest in? Picking, I don't think is really the issue. There are huge machines. They look like combines. They're not. They go between the rows of grapes and they pull the grapes in when they're mature. And they are transported to trucks, which take them to the crushers. And that's where they become juice, and that juice becomes wine. So that's technology that's already been invested in. What we're really talking about is seasonal technology. And I don't know of any seasonal technology. I do know of seasonal workers. That is, workers who have to be with us for the entire growing season because pruning, and that's on all manner of fruit that's grown there. And it goes for other things across the country as well. We don't just grow fruit and we don't just grow it in Niagara-on-the-Lake. Anyway, if you look at fruit in Niagara, because that's my example, during my 10 years there, it was commonplace to see Mexicans. I mentioned them, Jamaicans, Chinese, Vietnamese, and they'd be in the area. They contributed to the economy because they bought in the food stores. They were visible because they were needed. There were many of them. They all, as well as others, wanted those jobs. And I'm not sure, regardless of the numbers, that Canadians really do. So my question is about whether the announcement, Justin Trudeau, puts the carts before the horse. And yes, pun was intended. Okay, I believe that I should go directly into another subject that involves Mr. Trudeau. We've been hearing from a lot lately. Why? Because they are in caucus, and we haven't heard tell of Justin Trudeau most of the summer. Now he's out there, and so are the others. So is Pierre Poilievre and Jagmeet Singh. Anyway, I'm telling you about tariffs on Chinese made EVs or electric vehicles because I'm guessing you're interested in that. I wouldn't be, because I've been feeding cement on the entire question of electric vehicles, much less making them Chinese or buying them from the Chinese. I don't have a problem with Chinese. I have a problem with electric vehicles. I know of not one dealer and not one Chinese made EV in Canada, however. Correct me if I'm wrong. The nasty word for me, indeed, is not Chinese. It's EV. I think EVs are, and this is a personal opinion I've held for a long time, they're the fax machine of 2024. Who uses fax machines these days? Well, I do have an answer to that. Your doctor does, and the pharmacy does. And I think it has something to do with seeing a prescription written in the handwriting of the doctor arrive at the drugstore so they can put that on file, and stamping it received and filled and sending it back. And I guess that scanners are an intermediary step that they don't want to take. Anyway, EV sales are pretty well down at this point anyway. The word got out, you see, that the batteries don't last forever, and that they're not renewable, and that they're really hard to get rid of. You can't just stick them in landfill. They use huge volumes of resources to manufacture, and the disposal of them, I don't even know what they do with them. Besides, while the cars don't burn any gasoline, there are still major impacts due to the hydrocarbons that are used in making the damn batteries. Friends have told me that they are paying not thousands, tens of thousands for replacement batteries at this point. So why would I want to opt for that? And that doesn't make me unique. As a matter of fact, it makes me Canadian, because EV sales are down, and noticeably so, to the point where some companies that had announced plant conversions, and I can think of Ford out in Oakville, wondering whether they should actually convert that plant and start building EVs in 2 years. Other friends who have elected to purchase have purchased hybrids, and they're loving the hybrids because they run on some gasoline. It basically turns a generator that charges a battery, so you don't need that plug-in. You know what I love? I love a technology that is just seeing the light of day, but will, in my view, take over completely in a few years. It's hydrogen. That's the next big thing. So you have to remember a little bit of your high school chemistry for this. When you were in high school and you immersed electrodes from a battery in water, one pole, I don't know whether it was the positive or the negative, I'm not that inclined towards high school chemistry at this stage of my life, but one pole caused the release of oxygen, one of the two components of water, and the other pole caused the release of hydrogen, which is the other component in water. So in high-tech terms, they have now built fuel cells, essentially a large plastic box holding water into electrodes. And when you turn on the electricity, and that would be more than a standard battery, but some kind of a battery in a car that was far less complex than the ones that are needed to run motors in cars, hydrogen and oxygen would be released. The hydrogen would then be captured and go to an internal combustion engine, not that different from one in your current gas guzzler's front compartment, or if you have a Volkswagen rear compartment, whatever. The point is, however, that hydrogen is what's burned, not hydrocarbons. And when hydrogen burns, it has an octane rating equivalent to about 150. And you may not know what octane is, and I may not know what octane is, but it has to do with how clean the burn is. And the standard gasoline octane that you would use would be anywhere between 87 and 93. Most cars these days, 89, 91. Those are your hydrocarbon vehicle octane ratings. And here's hydrogen, which is being liberated from water, for goodness sakes, and it burns at 150 octane. The hydrogen is fed to the cylinders, a spark is applied, and bam, the energy released makes the engine turn. That propels your vehicle. So you're not carrying a big oxygen tank around with you, which is dangerous. They did try that 20, 30 years ago, and I believe there were taxis driving around downtown Toronto with hydrogen tanks in the back, and some gasoline stations that kept hydrogen on premises. Not a good idea. But filling your car up with water, that's not so bad. So the hydrogen is burned, the oxygen goes out the tailpipe. Think of this. You could lock yourself in a garage while the car was running, nothing would happen to you. All you'd be breathing is pure air, maybe laced with some water vapor, also known as steam. Can't kill you, can't even hurt you. So if there's another car in my future, I'll buy the one that I can fill up with water and emit zero pollution. All right. We'll be back in a moment and we'll be talking about consumer debt in Canada.
You're with the Sherman Report. Daily news commentary available at Apple Podcasts, Spotify, with video posted on YouTube and Facebook. Here's Peter Sherman.
So I'm reading in the paper yesterday. Let me not say so. I'm reading in the paper yesterday. That's an old expression that travels through life with me. I'm reading on the screen from the paper yesterday, and I noticed that credit card debt levels in Canada have risen to a 17-year high. A 17-year high caught my eye. Why? Because there was a time when Canadians were known as the world's ultimate savers. We were the best at this. We were never spendthrifts, and consumer debt was always well in hand. Not that long ago, but long enough ago that I remember it and some of you may not. Either we stopped bringing our kids up with a sense of fiscal responsibility, or it just went out the window with a lot of other things when COVID came along. Collectively, we consumers owe $2.5 trillion. I find it even harder to say that because there's not one of you out there who can conceive, other than a bunch of zeros, of what $1 trillion is. What is $1 trillion? Money forever. $2.5 trillion. And add that to ever ballooning unemployment, and we've got a boatload of trouble here and much more on the way. Of the $2.5 trillion, credit card debt alone is at $122 billion. And the banks should love that. It runs 30% interest, sometimes more, sometimes less, but it's still large. And if it weren't the banks charging it, it would be described as usurious. Anyway, I know it might be lower, it might be higher, but sure as hell, it is big interest. And it is high enough now that you could probably make a loan shark blush. Anyway, part of the issue is people signed record low mortgages in the depths of COVID, and that would put it somewhere in 2020. Those were generally 5-year mortgage terms, with renewals now coming up and the numbers sitting in the 5% and then some range. That means that you're going to go from some payment here to some payment here. And it's that in between that's causing a lot of grief. Maybe you think a bit of a more aggressive approach to bringing generally the bank rates down ought to be applied by the Bank of Canada. Their agenda calls for looking at the rates and announcing the same or new rates in, I guess it's somewhere between 1 and 3 weeks from now. It's in September. Anyway, they're the guys who, because they wanted to control inflation, raised the damn rates 10 times and tenfold, from 0.5% to 5% over about 15 months between 2022 and 2023. Why did they push the rates up so fast? And why did they push them up so far? Well, the theory says if you make things expensive, fewer people will buy things on borrowed money, especially credit card borrowed money. People may be running those credit cards up high, but I think a lot of people are not doing it because they want to. The economy has slowed now. Watch the consumer banks entice people with lower rates to initiate the reverse effect. Up and down like a jackhammer, or maybe I should use the analogy up and down like a toilet seat. But if you live in an urban center where purchase prices and mortgages, and we're talking homes now and buildings, they'll literally put you under. You have to be very careful. And when I say that, I'm not overstating a point. What's happening as these mortgages become due right now or over the next 3, 4, 5, 6, 12 months, they are going to put people under. And that in and of itself is a bad thing. And new houses are not selling very well, and resales are not selling very well in the market that I'm in, which is Toronto. And I don't think that Toronto is particularly different from any other place in Canada. And from what I hear about the United States, although their mortgage interest is deductible, they feel lucky if they get a 6 or 7% rate. Anyway, that's the United States. So what do you do when those must-have purchases are forced upon you? The kids need things. It's back to school, for example. You whip out the credit card and you pray that you'll be able to maneuver beyond paying interest only when that bill comes in and the month is at a close. Experts have told us that we should all have at least 3 months cash in reserve at all times to keep us going while we get busy fixing the problem. A two-salary household, now the norm, where one of the people working loses her job or his job, that's a good example because companies, also right now under the gun, are having to pare expenses, just like the rest of us. And how do companies pare expenses? Often by letting people go and making do on smaller numbers of people, or just simply because they're not selling as many widgets and they don't need as many people. Nobody wants to set out just to fire people. They do it because they're trying to control expenses and stay in business. Anyway, the published unemployment rate has spiked to almost 6.5%. Experts on that figure tell us to double it because there are always people who are not counted because they've fallen off the records because their EI has expired or because they've stopped looking for a job. Meanwhile, the hardest hit are the young people. About 14% of people between ages 15 and 24 have no job. And that's just the published rate. Again, the published rates are always lower than reality. So during COVID, all of these danger levels showing in consumer debt were moderate. They were less than moderate versus dangerous. Why? It wasn't easy to make new large purchases. You couldn't just run around from store to store. Yeah, we all shopped on online a lot. Amazon packages abounded in any lobby of any building or at your front door. But that was then and this is now. Plus, the feds dispensed stimulus to individuals. You remember that? Then you had to pay it back. Businesses got it as well. Mortgages were under 2%. Once the lockdowns ended, out came the credit cards. And once 4 years had elapsed, which is kind of now, mortgage renewals became an issue. Bottom line, trouble's not coming. It's already here. I'm one of those who believes the Bank of Canada needs to make a bold statement, and it needs to do it soon. And that would be when it announces the next rate change in September. Bold in terms of providing some confidence and bold enough for banks to ease off with consumers. Back in a moment on EVs, China, and the general market.
Now, the Sherman Report continues.
Well, not many months ago, the condo where I live decided to undertake installation of car chargers for those wishing to purchase electric vehicles. It was optional. You buy the charger for about $9,000. And by the way, this is not the same topic I was on before about EVs generally. This is about what's going on now and what Canada is doing about it. Anyway, it was optional. You bought the charger for about $9,000 installed, and then you began to pay by the hour for metered usage as you charged and burned up the electricity required to charge your car's great big lithium-ion battery. And I'm told that this is a pretty typical pricing for condominiums. Anyway, I have never had any wish to own an electric car. I mentioned that before. I might consider a hybrid if and when I'm ever in the market for another vehicle. Here's my reasoning, and it's just my reasoning. Elon Musk is a genius, and yes, he made a lot of and sold a lot of something called a Tesla. But business is down now, both for Elon and for all the car makers that are into the business of electrics. And my view is based on what I call the fax machine model. Wow, did we ever need fax machines once upon a time? It was an old technology dating back to the old wire photos that newspapers used. Remember when you could see those photos were grainy and they were all composed of thousands of tiny little dots, and together those dots in different shades of light and dark made up something that resembled a picture. You'd never see a picture like that now in a paper, but that's what they used, I don't know, 50 years ago. Well, We used fax, which came from that technology, relentlessly to send documents. And that in turn went back to a FedEx strike once upon a time in the States. Anyway, you could send documents, you could send photos, you could send signatures back and forth on faxes, and you all know that. Then along came the personal computer, which kept getting better and more utilitarian all the time. And then scanners happened. Scanners came along. And I don't have to explain any of these things because you all have them or have access to them. You could scan all of the items that you used to send via fax. And the scan would be attached to an email and it would pop out of the recipient's inbox or pop into the recipient's inbox within a moment or two of you sending it. Didn't matter where you were in the world or where the person at the other end was in the world. But that's the evolution of the great fax utility to scan documents. That's how long it took, 25 years approximately, time frame lasted, and it speaks to how quickly we see technology evolving. And I compare EVs to fax because I think that cycle is not unlike fax. I mentioned before the whole issue of moving to hydrogen. The battery-powered Teslas and all the other manufacturers built them, and they sold slowly. Then the prices started to drop, and sales became more brisk, and people started talking about them. And now they're old enough to need battery replacements. And first, those batteries are huge, and they're full of all kinds of rare earths and things that are not renewable and not easily disposed of. And the other factor, and very concerning, is the cost, often in the many thousands and even in the tens of thousands of dollars to replace one of those batteries, which explains why sales have fallen off. And hybrids are what people are selecting, and only then if they desire that technology. So I'm gave you a bit of a rundown before of using hydrogen from a hydrogen fuel cell and talked to you about octane levels. I'm not going to repeat that. I'm simply going to say that if we burn hydrogen and get rid of the oxygen, which is a non-pollutant, what we've got is a byproduct called water. Wouldn't you love that? Wouldn't you just love that? Well, the good news is some car manufacturers are already advertising the technology. As to what I hear, there are a couple of car manufacturers who are releasing 2025 model year cars that run on hydrogen fuel cells. The other aspect of man and his car, which is a love affair, to be sure, is where we're going literally and figuratively. Do you think the car that we know where you sit behind a steering wheel, watch your speed, operate your brakes is actually here to stay? I'll probably have departed the planet, let's say, by then. But I expect in 20 years, most people will get where they have to go in a driverless vehicle that picks you up and deposits you, charging your credit or debit card for each ride. Talk about changing lives. They won't even build houses with garages anymore. Not now, but soon. Anyway, the little verbal essay that I just gave you was inspired by our non-inspiring Prime Minister, who has decided that we have to change the way we deal with electric cars now that China has gotten into the business. And let me show you a little bit of Prime Minister Trudeau discussing this.
Today, we're taking yet another step to ensure that Canada is the country of choice to make the things that'll drive the new 21st century green economy. We're listening to automakers, we're listening to workers. Shortly, we will be introducing a 100% tariff on Chinese-made electric vehicles and a 25% tariff on Chinese steel and aluminum. See, because of our government's choices and the hard work of hundreds of thousands of Canadian auto workers, we are transforming Canada's automotive sector to be a global leader in building the vehicles of tomorrow. But actors like China have chosen to give themselves an unfair advantage in the global marketplace, compromising the security of our critical industries and displacing dedicated Canadian autos and metal workers. So we're taking action to address that.
And that's what our Prime Minister is doing, taking action and addressing it, which is interesting because he followed suit after the United States announced the same thing. Justin Trudeau has announced, and you heard it there, a 100% tariff on Chinese EVs being imported to Canada. And the idea is to keep a slew of cheap imports out in order to cover our domestic manufacturers and the jobs that they have created. Okay, let's look at another aspect where, if this is really the time to save money, you might have an interest. You've probably heard of, maybe you've used Flair Airlines. Flair Airlines, one of the cut-rate airlines operating in Canada. I have a son who lives in British Columbia, and when he visits, he figures 4 to 5 hours on an airplane is hateful. It's his opinion. It doesn't matter how you slice it. He doesn't like flying. But he does it because it's kind of better than walking from BC. Anyway, for him, it's a bus in the sky. 5 hours later, he sees mom and dad. And with that in mind, he has flown Flair a number of times, and he likes nothing about it except the price. And that's what they're selling. Since he likes nothing about flying anyway, why not? He's had fares under $300 round trip from Vancouver or from Abbotsford, which I find amazing, but I've seen the receipts myself. These guys just have to have safe and serviceable airlines and crew to fly them safely. And it seems to me that Flair has both. But do you know what they have now? They have fares starting at $1. Fares, I'll say it again, fares starting at $1. A buck a beer. No, a buck a ticket. Flair has announced airfares flying northbound from the USA, Jamaica, Dominican Republic, and Mexico at a base fare of $1. Flair believes that this is an unique gesture to give something back to consumers. Others in the airline industry say it's just a gimmick. Well, you know, everything's a gimmick, if you want to see it that way. Marketing people at Flair say that southbound winter flying is tightly booked. Surprise! Those aren't the flights starting at $1. But the northbound flights have any number of empty seats during that period. And that means, in marketing terms, there's really no opportunity cost to put a bum in a seat. And they expect to make this permanent. Nothing is changing much at Flair. It's a bargain airline. The dollar fares will be available only on specific flights and during specific periods of the year. Eric Tanner is Vice President of Revenue Management at Flair, and here's a quote from him. He says, in the springtime, all of our northbound flights returning to Canada, that is northbound, from the Caribbean and warm destinations are quite full, but all the southbound flights are empty. Again, surprise. You will probably see in April a lot of southbound flights available for $1. That's the end of the quote. Is it a gimmick? In a way, it's a gimmick, but in another way, it's not. And this is me talking, not the VP marketing, not someone interpreting what airlines are doing. It's just a consumer looking at it. First, don't expect to select your seat in advance. Don't expect even a cup of coffee or a glass of water. Don't expect any kind of baggage allowance. Whatever you take, you'll pay for. Flair and everybody else will upsell you on all of that. I've often flown from the United States, and when searching for fares, I would see, for example, Buffalo to Fort Lauderdale at, let's pick a number, $65. And I'm not talking about a million years ago. I'm talking about recently. And then I look at the return fare to get back, and it's $200 or $300. So if you take the whole thing and add it together, you're paying $265, $300 plus for a round trip ticket, Buffalo to Fort Lauderdale, which sounds an awful lot more like what that should cost. So that's what the $200 return fee is about. What this says is not that anyone is ripping you off. Airlines, like any well-managed businesses, track precise traffic levels by the time of day, by the week of the month, by the month itself, by the year, weekends, holidays, separating those out, all of it. And if they know all of this information, and they do, they can easily fill seats by offering travelers a break on days and in seasons when they know that they're not going to be full. On the other hand, if it's April and everybody from Canada is in Florida and wants to return, that's not going to be cheap, not on any airline. I say good for Flair. They will see increased passenger counts, and they will see more revenue. That's it for today. It's a Wednesday, and I'll see you tomorrow right here on the Sherman Report.
The Sherman Report, available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and the video version at YouTube, Facebook, and always at petersherman.com. Thanks for listening to the Sherman Report. If you'd like to connect with Peter directly, just go to petersherman.com.